A month from tomorrow will be the start of the NBA regular season. Training camp will be beginning shortly. The preseason is just a little over 2 weeks away. And as we near closer to the time where everyone is coming up with their preseason predictions, projections, and rankings for the NBA season and how it's going to shake out, there is no team out there that has a bigger question mark going into the year than the Chicago Bulls, a team that exceeded expectations, everyone's wildest expectations to start the season last year after so many were critical of their offseason moves last summer, to then completely falling off after the All-Star break between a combination of injuries, their strength of schedule becoming harder, and also just the fact that the team's identity had taken a hit because guys were in and out of the lineup. And when you look across the rest of the Eastern Conference, there is a bit more certainty as it relates to their rosters. Sure, there are some question marks as it relates to teams who made some bigger roster adjustments, but for the Bulls, a team that did not make major roster changes, a team that struggled down the stretch of the season, and a team in which the status of their starting point guard remains to be up in the air, you cannot definitively say how this team is going to stack up in the Eastern Conference, and that's what we're going to be talking about in today's video. So what's going on, everyone? You're listening to Bulls Central here. Hope you're all doing well. Guys, we are less than 100 subscribers to hitting 30,000 subscribers. Once again, I cannot thank you guys enough for all the love and support on the channel since starting it a little over a year and a half ago. Don't forget, I'll be doing a giveaway once the channel reaches 30K subs, in which I'll be giving 3 lucky winners tickets to Bulls games or a jersey of their choosing if they are not able to attend a game at the United Center. All you have to do is subscribe to the channel to be included in the drawing, and I will be closing it once the channel hits 30K. But anyway, let's talk about the Bulls. So I often get asked, where do you have the Bulls finishing in the Eastern Conference this season, especially with all the aggressive moves teams like the Cavs, Hawks, and Celtics have made, and not to mention the fact that you still have the Bucks, the Sixers, and the Heat as strong contenders in the East? And it's valid. It's a valid question, although I usually say it's a little too early to be making those kind of predictions. I usually save that until after preseason games are concluded, but even then, despite it being too early, I think this is probably the hardest prediction to make on how the Bulls are going to perform that I can at least remember for a very long time. And I'll explain what I mean by that. Here's the thing. No one, and I mean no one, thought that the Bulls were going to be sitting at the top of the East come February of last season. Even the most optimistic Bulls fans didn't think that the Bulls were going to be the best team in the East as we approached the All-Star break. And if you say you did, you're kidding yourself, because as much talent as the Bulls acquired, there were still going to be questions on how a brand new team and roster would look together, and also just a lot of it all depended on DeMar DeRozan and where he was actually going to do and how he was going to show up in his 32-year season. No one would have thought he was going to go off like he did and be an MVP candidate. Like, you wouldn't have even thought that in his best days with the Raptors that he would be in the MVP conversation. So no one thought that the Bulls were going to get off to the hot start that they did. And then, of course, we saw how hard the Bulls fell with the way they were met with some adversity. They got a little fatigued towards the end of the season. Obviously, the injuries played into that as well. And there were times where they just straight up looked non-competitive in some of those final games of the year. Like, it really looked like we were watching the rebuilding Jim Boylan era Bulls at times towards the end of the season. So right away, going into the season, you have no idea what to expect from this team. Because the Lonzo injury aside, which I'll get into, even when guys started coming back, Caruso came back from his injury, Javonte Green, Derrick Jones Jr., guys obviously that missed time. Obviously, Zach missed some time as well and never really got fully back to himself. When guys started coming back, the Bulls still didn't do that well. And yes, obviously Lonzo played a big factor in that, there's no question, but people also forget that when Lonzo went out with COVID, I believe it was back in late December, early January, the Bulls were still playing at a high level. It was actually when they went on that 9-game winning streak. They were dominating and not missing a beat despite Lonzo being out. So again, even with the Lonzo injury, there was something off about the team that made them wildly unpredictable. I've said it before, and I even asked 2 longtime Bulls insiders and historians who have been covering this team for decades, in Casey Johnson and Sam Smith, when I had them on the channel. They had never seen anything like this, in which you had such a dramatic drop-off in terms of just general competitiveness and energy from a team in a single season, to where you had a team look like a true contender in one half of the season, and then a damn near lottery team in the other. I've never seen anything like that with how inconsistent the Bulls were last year. So that's one reason why the Bulls are one of the biggest question marks going into this season, is just how inconsistent they were as a team. But really the biggest question mark is health, more specifically the health of Lonzo Ball. Look, I don't need to go into the detail on why Lonzo's health is concerning, as I've talked about it multiple times on the channel. All I will say is anytime you go from having a 6 to 8 week estimated timeline for recovery on a given injury And 9 months later, after the initial injury and subsequent surgery that followed to heal said injury, and still there is uncertainty as to when he'll return to the lineup. That is a huge concern, not just for this upcoming season, but for Lonzo's long-term health after you sign him to a long-term deal to be the Bulls' point guard for the future. It also doesn't sit well with Bulls fans when you know that Lonzo has never had a season in the NBA where he didn't miss time due to injury. And again, he's only 24 years old. It's not like this is a guy that we're talking about in his 30s who's been struggling with injuries at the back end of their career. And of course, I don't need to explain why Lonzo's health and the uncertainty of whether he'll be back to start the season is a concern and how that will impact the Bulls and their performance. Like, we saw just how important Lonzo was to the success of this team between his playmaking and ability to push the pace in transition, acting as the Bulls' floor general and setting up more plays for the Bulls' leading scorers in DeMar DeRozan and Zach Lavine and Vucevic, but also between his outside shooting, that ability to help spread the floor and draw double teams away from guys like DeMar and Zach to have them operate in the mid-range or slash into the basket without getting hounded by the opposing team's defense, since they know they can't just leave Lonzo open for threes given he shoots from outside at a 42% clip on over 7 attempts per game. Like, people forget that Lonzo, before he got injured, was one of the best three-point shooters in the league by efficiency and volume. That's huge in today's NBA to be able to have a sharpshooter like that, especially when you have a guy like DeMar who needs floor spacing to operate in his desired zone in the mid-range. And above all of that, I mean, just Lonzo's defense. He's a lockdown defender on the perimeter, and between him and Caruso, who were one of the more elite duos on the defensive end by the numbers, this is just a huge loss for the Bulls when you don't have that perimeter defense, especially when the Bulls' interior defense isn't that great. And they still didn't really solve for it by adding rim protectors this offseason. I actually saw a stat the other day on Twitter because I do feel one of the more overlooked stats that isn't talked about enough because it's not a common stat metric that is often shown when you look at a player's general numbers is deflections per game. Because you may not necessarily get a steal or a block, which is what people look at when you look at defensive numbers, but if you're constantly pestering teams by getting in passing lanes and deflecting balls that lead to turnovers or deflecting when playing on ball that forces the ball handler to make a bad play, that is so crucial to a team's overall defense. And among league leaders in deflections per game for last season, you see both Caruso and Lonzo at 5 and 6 respectively across the entire league. You also factor in their minutes played, especially for Caruso, and you see why this is such a difference maker for the Bulls and their success. And of course, just having Lonzo's general IQ and wherewithal on the court, like as great as DeMar and Zach are, their basketball IQ is not on the same level as Lonzo Ball's. And in late game situations, you need a guy who knows what to do and how to operate if things start getting out of hand. So yes, the biggest question mark for the Bulls for this upcoming season is Lonzo and his health, because at the time of this recording, it's been reported that he's going to miss training camp and likely the start of the regular season. Now, that has been reported by the media. That has not officially been confirmed by the Bulls front office or their PR team, but you'd have to think that it's probably true as we're just days away from training camp and all indicators are showing Lonzo will not be a participant. The other thing I will say about Lonzo and why this makes it such a big uncertainty for the Bulls is the fact that even when Lonzo does eventually come back and gets onto the court, how do we know for certain that he's going to be 100% back to the player that we saw at the start of last season? How do we know that all of the injuries that he sustained won't impact his play long term? Keep in mind, this is the second surgery he's had to repair his torn meniscus in his left knee, the same knee. Like, do I have to remind everyone how Rose returned after all of his injuries? Yes, different injuries. Obviously, Ball is in the same caliber level of player that Rose is. But when a player has this many injuries at such a young age, you can't say with confidence that whenever they are able to come back, that they're going to be the same player. Obviously, I hope that won't be the case with Lonzo, but you have to wonder if he's still going to have the same level of quickness playing in transition and quickness on the defensive end. You'd hope his outside shooting won't be impacted that much by injuries, and obviously his IQ won't be impacted. He'll always have that regardless of how often he gets injured, but we don't know if Lonzo is going to have a drop-off in his play with all of these accumulating injuries. Now, aside from Lonzo, you also have the uncertainty whether DeMar is actually going to be able to replicate what he was able to do last season. It was pretty unprecedented what he was able to do last year at age 32, and for the Bulls, you kind of need him to at least be 90% of what he was last season to even remain competitive in the East. And then Zach Lavine. Let's not forget the fact that he was suffering from injuries which clearly impacted his game when you saw that drop off in his play in the back half of the year. Zach did have a scope on his knee this offseason, which was positive, showed no structural damage, so I'm not really concerned about Zach and how he'll show up because he has also been looking great in some of the offseason workout videos we've seen. But it is something that is in the back of my mind as far as whether we'll still see the star player of Zach Lavine that we saw at the beginning of the year versus Zach at the end of the year. Then, of course, there's Patrick Williams. Missed most of last season with an injury. The Bulls are really relying on him to make a massive jump this season. You're placing a lot of importance on a third-year player, only 21 years old, to make that kind of leap going into his third year. You're desperately going to need his defense in the front court. Then you also have the Bulls' newest additions in Andre Drummond, Goran Dragic, their draft pick, and Dalen Terry. How are they going to show up with this new roster? You're definitely going to need Drummond to be that backup five that the Bulls didn't have last season. We're going to need his rebounding as the Bulls struggled rebounding the ball, especially on the offensive end, to get second chance opportunities. And then, of course, how much should the Bulls be relying on the continuity factor? It's something the front office has continued to preach, which is fine because history has shown that continuity of a roster over a course of multiple seasons have had more success than teams that are constantly turning over their roster. But what if the continuity isn't able to be maintained because guys just cannot stay healthy? And look, I know this is coming off like a doom and gloom outlook or that I'm fear-mongering for all the negative and concerning things going into the season. It's very possible a lot of these aspects I've mentioned aren't going to be issues and the Bulls are probably going to be fine. But when people ask me, where do you see the Bulls fitting in the East this season? I really don't know that I can answer that because there is such a big question mark with this team. Like, as cliche as it sounds, when you really factor in all the things that go right, that could make the Bulls a potential top 3 team in the East. Or if everything goes wrong, Lonzo misses significant time, Zach still isn't 100%, DeMar doesn't repeat what we saw last season and starts declining, Vooch regresses even further, Pat doesn't make that leap that we expected. Like, there are so many things that could go wrong where the Bulls could conceivably be a play-in team or even miss the playoffs. That really isn't a stretch either when you think about how stacked the Eastern Conference is. The top 4 teams between the Bucks, Heat, Celtics, Sixers, they're still going to be good. The Hawks added an all-star. The Cavs added also an all-star. Those were 2 teams who finished below the Bulls last season. Also, don't rule out the Nets. They're getting KD and Kyrie back, presumably. And don't forget, they also have Ben Simmons. I know a lot of people rag on him because of his shenanigans and the fact that he can't shoot, but the dude was still a top defensive player in the league, an all-NBA player, multiple all-star. The guy is not a scrub. That's another team that was below the Bulls in the standings last year. And again, you still have the Raptors, a feisty team that always seems to outperform expectations every season. And I'm not necessarily worried about either of these teams, but they could be decent and exceed expectations, that being the Wizards. Now they have Bradley Beal back. The Hornets, LaMelo Ball going into his 3rd year, although they lost Bridges, good riddance to that guy. Not worried at all about the Knicks because it's the Knicks. But look, with the way the East has improved from last season, the fact that it's still going to be more competitive than it has in years, it's really going to be a tall order for the Bulls to be one of the top teams in the East unless everything goes absolutely right. And although I will be giving my East standing predictions prior to the start of the season, as I always do, I feel like this is going to be one of the hardest seasons to predict on how the Bulls will do because of all this uncertainty surrounding this team. My hope is that we'll have a little more clarity as we get closer to the start of the season. Maybe we get a more definitive timeline on Lonzo's return. Hell, maybe the Bulls will make a surprise trade before the start that really actually upgrades their roster. Only time will tell. I'm curious to see how you guys think the Bulls will stack up with the rest of the Eastern Conference based on what we know today. So let me know in the comments, and as always, guys, be sure to subscribe if you're a Bulls fan, as I do post daily Bulls content. Thanks again for tuning in, guys, and I'll catch you in the next one.